I thought I was building a life for my family, but while I was busy chasing success, my wife found comfort in the arms of someone I never expected, my own brother. The night I discovered the truth changed everything. Looking back now, it's almost surreal to think about how everything fell apart. At the time, I didn't see it happening. It was gradual, like slowly sinking into deep water without realizing how far under you are. In the beginning, Savannah and I had so much going for us. Those early years of marriage felt like a dream, at least from my perspective. Lucas was born just a year after our wedding, and Emma came 2 years later. It was a whirlwind, but the good kind. We had our hands full, no doubt, but we were in it together, partners, a team. But like a lot of things in life, that balance shifted without either of us really noticing. I threw myself into my career because I wanted to provide the best life I could for them. That meant working long hours, 12-hour days, weekends, non-stop grind. I justified it to myself as something I had to do. Meanwhile, something was happening at home that I wasn't paying attention to. Savannah was changing. Slowly. So slowly that I missed the signs entirely at first. She became quieter and more distant. I didn't understand it. Raising Lucas and Emma took so much from her, and I saw how exhausted she was trying to hold everything together. I admired her for it, she was doing so much. But what I didn't see was how that exhaustion was eating away at her, or how much she felt I was neglecting her. She tried to tell me. She brought it up on more than one occasion, how she felt left behind and overlooked. But I brushed her concerns aside every single time. Work always gave me a convenient excuse. Deadlines, projects, client meetings. I kept telling her I'd make it up to her, that we'd have time later. I never followed through though. I didn't make her a priority, and now I know how much I should have. It wasn't until my younger brother Mason came back into the picture that I started noticing the cracks in everything. He'd been abroad for a few years, living with that carefree spirit he's always had. Mason never worried about plans or responsibilities, he just went after what made him happy. When he returned, I was genuinely glad to see him again. I didn't realize then that his presence would stir something in Savannah, and set off a chain of events I never saw coming. I first noticed something was off when Savannah started spending more time with Mason. At first, I didn't think much of it, he was my brother after all. Family. But slowly I began to see them together more often. They'd go out for coffee, grab lunch, or just hang out at our house. It all seemed harmless, at least that's what I told myself. Then I started to catch the subtle things, like the way Savannah laughed around him. It wasn't forced or tired like it had been with me for a while. It was genuine, carefree. She seemed lighter, more relaxed, more at ease than I'd seen her in months. And that was the key, wasn't it? She was searching for relief, for someone who could make her feel more than just a mother or a wife weighed down by endless responsibilities. Mason stepped into that role. He listened to her in a way I hadn't. He made her feel seen and alive again. I didn't realize how much she needed that, until it was too late. It started with small moments, like sharing a glass of wine after a long day. But those moments between Savannah and Mason grew more frequent. I kept telling myself it wasn't a big deal. But I couldn't ignore how much Savannah seemed to be changing. She looked different, happier. She started smiling more, like the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. But something about it felt off. It wasn't me making her feel that way. Suddenly, she was attending yoga classes regularly, reconnecting with old friends, and even spending time with a new acquaintance, Clara, whom she'd met through one of those classes. I didn't understand it. I didn't know that Savannah was quietly rebuilding herself, reclaiming the parts of her identity I had neglected for years. The moment it all began to click for me happened one night when I came home late from work, like always. There they were, Savannah and Mason, sitting on the couch, laughing softly about something. The way they interacted, the familiarity between them, it wasn't just friendly anymore. It was deeper, almost intimate. It hit me like a punch to the gut. Savannah had become someone I didn't recognize, and it tore me apart. I tried to keep my voice steady as I confronted her. Savannah, what's going on? With you? With Mason? You're not the same. You've been pulling away from me. Her response was cold, almost dismissive. Ethan, I'm just trying to have some time for myself. You wouldn't understand. I tried to push further, desperate for clarity, but she cut me off. You've been too busy with work, she said, her voice tense and tired. I've been managing everything around here on my own. I can't keep doing this anymore. Hearing those words made me realize just how deep the divide between us had grown. I need space. The words hit me harder than I expected, but I stayed silent. What could I even say? She wasn't wrong. I had been too wrapped up in work to realize how much Savannah needed me. And now here she was telling me she needed space. I didn't fully grasp what that meant at the time. In the following weeks, her behavior shifted even more. She grew distant, not just from me but from the family. She started skipping out on our family dinners, always finding an excuse to be somewhere else. When I asked her about it, she'd brush me off with a tired, "I'm just exhausted." But I knew that wasn't the full story. There was something deeper going on, something she wasn't telling me. Then one evening I came home and saw them again, Savannah and Mason, sitting together in the living room sharing a bottle of wine. That was the moment I couldn't ignore the truth anymore. It was the last straw. There was something between them. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but deep down I knew. I couldn't stay quiet this time. I confronted her, my voice tense. "What's going on, Savannah? This isn't just about being tired. You've been pulling away from me, from the kids. And now you're spending all this time with Mason." She looked at me, her gaze cold and unwavering. "You don't get it, Ethan. You're never here. I'm stuck dealing with the kids, with everything. And you don't even notice. You don't see me anymore." Her words stung, but the worst part was, she was right. I had been absent. I'd neglected her, and now I was finally seeing the price of that neglect. But even then, I didn't fully comprehend how much further things would spiral. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs clear as day, but at the time I was too blind, too distracted by my own responsibilities to connect the dots. As the days went on, Savannah and Mason continued spending more and more time together. At first, I tried to rationalize it. I told myself it was harmless, that they were just reconnecting as siblings-in-law who'd always shared a close bond growing up. But deep down, I knew it wasn't the same anymore. There was something different about their connection, something I couldn't ignore no matter how much I wanted to. I didn't realize it at the time, but their bond had crossed a line, one I didn't see until it was too late. It all began with small, seemingly harmless moments. A lunch here, an afternoon spent chatting at the house there. It was easy to dismiss at first. I thought, they're just catching up. But when I worked late, leaving Savannah and Mason alone together in our home, something began to shift. That night is seared into my memory. I came home later than usual, expecting to find them as always just sitting around, chatting casually. But the atmosphere was different the moment I walked through the door. They were on the couch, laughing softly, yet something felt off. There was an energy in the air between them, something unspoken but palpable. I couldn't quite name it at the time, but deep down, I knew this wasn't just a friendly visit anymore. Savannah looked at me, but it wasn't the way she used to. Her gaze felt distant, like she was physically there but emotionally somewhere else. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself I was just being paranoid. I wanted so badly to believe that I was imagining things. But the truth had a way of creeping in, refusing to be ignored. A few nights later, it all came crashing down. I stayed late at work again, the same routine I'd fallen into for years. It was supposed to be just another night, but when I got home, I walked into something that would haunt me forever. Savannah and Mason were in the kitchen, standing far too close. The bottle of wine on the counter and two half-finished glasses told a story I didn't want to hear. They hadn't heard me come in. For a moment I just stood there, frozen, watching them. When Savannah finally turned around and saw me, her face was flushed. There was something raw and vulnerable in her expression, like she'd been caught. But she wasn't apologetic. Not in the slightest. She glanced at Mason, then back at me, and that look said everything I didn't want to believe. I knew right then. I didn't need any more proof. The way they stood there, the tension between them, and Mason's refusal to meet my eyes told me that something had crossed the line. I went to bed that night, numb, replaying every moment in my head, searching for answers that I already had. It wasn't long before I learned the full extent of what had happened. Savannah and Mason had kissed that night. But it wasn't a quick, friendly peck. No, it was something else entirely, deep, passionate, an expression of months of bottled-up emotions. In that kiss, everything she had been holding inside came pouring out. Savannah had felt abandoned by me for so long, and Mason became the one to fill that void. He was there for her in the ways I hadn't been, emotionally anchoring her when she felt lost. It didn't take much for that emotional connection to become something more. And by the time I understood how far things had gone, it was already too late. I didn't know it at the time, but Savannah had already begun justifying everything to herself. In her mind, I wasn't the man she had fallen in love with anymore. She told herself I had abandoned her when she needed me most. And Mason, who had started as a source of emotional support, had now become something more. He was her savior, the person who filled the emptiness I had unknowingly left behind. Savannah was trapped in her own need for connection, desperate for someone to make her feel whole again. It's hard to describe how quickly things escalated, but neither of them let it show. They played their roles well. I was blind to it, though there were subtle signs. Signs I ignored because I didn't want to believe what was happening. She began going out more often, her enthusiasm for spending time with me almost completely gone. Whenever Mason's name came up, her entire demeanor would shift. There was a spark in her eyes, a liveliness that felt out of place. I didn't fully understand it at first, but as the days went on, it became harder and harder to overlook. The breaking point came when I finally started catching glimpses of something I didn't want to see. I would walk into a room and find them together, and the way Mason looked at her was different. At first, it was subtle, fleeting moments I tried to dismiss, but soon, it became undeniable. Then came the discovery that shattered me. One night, after Savannah went to bed, I found her phone lying on the kitchen counter. I hadn't gone looking for evidence, but something drew me to it. My gut told me there was more going on than I could explain, and I couldn't keep ignoring that feeling. When I unlocked her phone, the truth hit me like a freight train. There they were, texts between Savannah and Mason. They weren't just casual messages. They were talking about their feelings for each other, the guilt they both carried, and worst of all, their plans for the future. Savannah had been confiding in Mason about our marriage, about struggles I hadn't even realized she was going through. I couldn't breathe. The ground felt like it was crumbling beneath me. In that moment, everything made sense. The distance, the secrecy, the change in her demeanor. I had lost her. And Mason, my own brother, had stolen her from me piece by piece, until she was no longer the woman I had married. The weight of those text messages was suffocating. I stared at the phone, the words blurring in front of me like a cruel joke. My mind reeled, unable to process the reality that Mason, the man I had trusted without question, was the one she had been turning to. He had become her anchor, the one who comforted her in ways I had failed to. And then I saw it, words that felt like a knife to the heart. Savannah admitted in the messages that she loved him. I didn't know how to handle it. My head was spinning. I wanted to throw the phone against the wall, to scream until my lungs gave out, to destroy something, anything, to stop the crushing weight of that betrayal. But instead, I just stood there, paralyzed, overwhelmed by a storm of emotions I couldn't contain. I set the phone down on the counter and walked away numb. There was no way to erase what I had just seen, no way to unlearn the truth. In that moment, I knew there was no turning back. The man I had been before all of this was gone. The next day passed in a blur, and once again I found myself coming home late after another grueling day at work. It was becoming a familiar pattern, one I had convinced myself was necessary to build a better future for my family. But reflecting on everything now, I see how misguided I was. At the start, Savannah and I had it all, or at least it seemed that way. Those first few years of marriage felt blissful. We had Lucas a year after the wedding, and then Emma came along 2 years later. Life became a whirlwind, but it was a beautiful one. We were overwhelmed, sure, but we faced it together. We were a team, or so I believed. But like so many things in life, that balance shifted without either of us realizing it. I was diving headfirst into my career, driven by the desire to provide the best life possible for my family. Long hours, endless projects, and late-night meetings became the norm. Meanwhile, Savannah was carrying the weight of everything at home. I saw how much it took out of her, but I didn't truly see her. I thought she was strong enough to handle it all, and I was proud of her, but somewhere along the line I lost sight of the woman I had married. She tried to talk to me about it, about how she felt neglected, but I brushed it off every time. I always had an excuse: work, deadlines, projects. Whenever she brought up her feelings, I'd promise her I'd make it up to her, but I never did. I didn't make her a priority, and deep down I knew it. It wasn't until Mason came back into our lives that I started noticing the cracks. He had been working abroad for a few years, living his carefree, spontaneous life. When he returned, I was happy to see him. I didn't know then what his arrival would set into motion. At first, his presence seemed innocent. Savannah and Mason would grab coffee or have lunch together. They'd spend time at our house, chatting and catching up. I thought nothing of it. He was family after all. But slowly little things began to stand out. The way Savannah laughed when she was around him, light and unburdened in a way I hadn't seen in months. The way she seemed so much more at ease in his presence. It was clear she was searching for something, an escape from the pressures weighing her down. She needed someone who could make her feel like more than just a mother or a wife tied to endless responsibilities. Mason filled that void. He made her feel alive again. I didn't realize how much she needed that until it was too late. Savannah started reconnecting with parts of herself I had neglected. She began attending yoga classes and met a new friend, Clara. She was reclaiming the identity she had lost, piece by piece. But at the time I couldn't comprehend it. I didn't understand the changes in her behavior. Then came that pivotal night. I returned home late as usual and found them together again. It was in that moment, watching the two of them, that the pieces began to fall into place. Everything I had missed, the distance, the secrecy, the emotional walls Savannah had built, suddenly made sense. I just hadn't been ready to face the truth. I came home late as usual and there she was, sitting on the couch with Mason. They were laughing about something, their voices low and familiar. But this time I could feel it in the air between them. It wasn't just friendly anymore. There was an intimacy there, a connection I couldn't ignore. It was subtle but undeniable. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in before Savannah finally noticed me. Her smile faded and she looked at me like I was a stranger. The distance in her gaze sent a chill through me. I tried to brush off the feeling, telling myself that I was overreacting, that this was just another one of those nights where I was tired and reading too much into things. A few days later, though, Savannah dropped the bombshell. "I need space," she said, her voice detached and distant. The words hit like a punch to the gut. I didn't say anything because, what could I say? She was right. I had been so consumed by work, by the endless meetings and deadlines, that I hadn't seen how much she needed me. Now she was asking for space and I didn't even fully understand what that meant. Over the next few weeks, Savannah's behavior shifted even more. She became increasingly distant. Family dinners became rare, and when we did have them, she found reasons to excuse herself early. Whenever I asked her what was going on, she'd brush me off with a tired, "I'm just exhausted." But I knew there was more to it than that. She didn't want to spend time with me anymore. Then there was Mason. She started spending more and more time with him. I tried to tell myself it was harmless, that they were just close because they had always gotten along. But I couldn't ignore the way her eyes lit up when his name came up in conversation. There was a spark there that hadn't been directed at me in a long time. One evening, I tried to confront her again. "Savannah, what's going on? You've been pulling away from me, from the kids, and now you're spending all this time with Mason?" She looked at me with a cold, almost detached expression. "You don't get it, Ethan. You're never around. I'm stuck here, stuck with the kids, with everything. And you don't even see it. You don't see me anymore." I stood there, speechless. She wasn't wrong. I had neglected her, buried under the weight of my responsibilities. I hadn't been there for her when she needed me most, and now I was seeing the consequences of my absence. But even then, I didn't grasp how much further things would go. I was still blind to the full reality of what was happening. Looking back now, I can see how it all began. It started with small, easy-to-ignore moments, a casual lunch, an afternoon spent chatting in the house. It all seemed innocent at the time. But those moments added up, and when I worked late, leaving Savannah and Mason alone, their relationship began to change. I'll never forget the night it all came crashing down. I came home later than usual, expecting to find them chatting on the couch, like always. Instead, I walked into the kitchen and saw them standing close together, too close. A bottle of wine sat on the counter, 2 empty glasses beside it. They hadn't heard me come in. When Savannah turned around and saw me, her face was flushed. There was a vulnerability in her eyes that I hadn't seen in months, like she'd been caught. But there was no guilt, no apology. She looked at Mason, then back at me, and in that moment, I knew. The truth was staring me in the face, and it was undeniable. Something had happened between them, and I had been too blind, too distracted to stop it. I hadn't seen it then, but their connection had crossed an unspoken line. That kiss between Savannah and Mason wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was passionate, raw, an expression of everything she had been holding back for months. She had felt abandoned by me, and Mason had become her emotional anchor. He gave her the support I had neglected to provide, and it didn't take long for that emotional bond to evolve into something more. I was oblivious to the full extent of their relationship, but over the next few weeks, things spiraled further. Mason and Savannah couldn't stay away from each other. They met in secret whenever I was working late or out of the house. They spent hours together, sharing everything, dreams, fears, and the deep pain that Savannah had kept hidden from me. What I failed to realize was that Mason, who had started as a lifeline for her emotional needs, had become her escape. Savannah was caught in her need for connection, for someone who could fill the void I had left. It's hard to explain how quickly it all escalated, especially because neither of them let it show. On the surface, they played their roles well. But there were signs, subtle at first, that I should have noticed. One of those signs came from Clara, a friend Savannah had met through yoga. Clara started to see changes in her. Savannah, who had always been social and outgoing, was suddenly withdrawing. She wasn't as open with her friends and seemed lost in thought more often than not. At home, I noticed that spark in her eyes whenever Mason's name came up, a spark that felt wrong. At first I didn't understand it, but with time, it became impossible to ignore. The tipping point came when I began catching small, uncomfortable glimpses of something deeper between them. I would find them together in a room, and Mason's gaze would linger on her in a way that wasn't purely innocent. It was subtle, just a momentary pause in his eyes, but as the days passed, it grew more obvious. There was a tension between them that I didn't want to acknowledge. The worst part, though, came with the discovery I could no longer turn away from. One night, I found myself once again face to face with the truth. I unlocked Savannah's phone and saw texts between her and Mason, conversations that laid everything bare. They weren't just talking about their feelings for each other. They were discussing our marriage, our struggles, and the pain I hadn't even known she was carrying. Reading those messages, I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Every piece of the puzzle fell into place all at once. The distance, the secrecy, the way Savannah had changed. It was all there, laid out in front of me in cold, unfiltered clarity. And in that moment, I knew. I had failed her in every way that mattered. I had failed to be present, to listen, to be the man she needed me to be. That night, I stood there, holding the weight of her betrayal in my hands, with no one to blame but myself. I confronted her, and it was anything but civil. At first, Savannah denied everything. I expected that. Denial was easier than facing what we both knew. But as the conversation went on, the lies unraveled. I had seen it all in the messages, the texts between her and Mason, their raw and painful confessions. Seeing it laid out in black and white was a different kind of agony. It wasn't just suspicion anymore, it was truth, undeniable and crushing. Mason, the man I had trusted with everything, had become the person she turned to, her emotional refuge. He had taken my place in ways I never imagined possible. I had sensed something was off between them, caught glimpses of a deeper connection, but seeing those words spelled out on her phone was like a punch to the gut. For a moment, I wanted to lose control. I wanted to scream, to throw the phone against the wall, to rage at the unfairness of it all. But I didn't. Instead, I placed the phone down on the counter, quietly walked away, and tried to process the impossible weight of what I had just learned. There was no going back to the man I had been before this. The next day, I knew I couldn't avoid it any longer. I came home late like usual, but this time I was ready. I had to face her. I had to hear the truth come from her lips. When I walked in, Savannah was sitting in the living room, quiet and tense. I sat down across from her, feeling my pulse pounding in my ears. I wanted to explode, to shout out all the hurt and betrayal I had bottled up. But instead, I asked the one question that had been gnawing at me for days. Why, Savannah? Why didn't you come to me? Why didn't you talk to me about how you were feeling? I would have listened. I could have helped. I could have tried. Her eyes welled with tears as she shook her head. I did try, Ethan. I really did. But every time I spoke to you about it, you'd just turn it into something about work or the kids. You never heard me. Her words hit me like a hammer. I had failed to see her pain because I was too wrapped up in my own world. But it didn't lessen the weight of what had happened. I trusted you, Savannah. More than anyone, I said, my voice trembling. And you've betrayed me. With him? Savannah's face twisted with guilt and sorrow. She couldn't deny it anymore. The truth lay between us now, raw and bleeding. Neither of us could pretend that things would ever be the same again. I never meant to hurt you, Ethan, Savannah said, her voice trembling. I didn't want this to happen. I thought I was just trying to find something that was missing in my life. I never meant for it to go this far. I couldn't listen anymore. Her words rang hollow in my ears. I turned away, desperate for space, for air. My mind was racing, my chest tight with rage and heartbreak. I wanted to scream, to destroy everything in sight, to do something, anything, to release the agony twisting inside me. I didn't know who I was anymore, and I didn't know who she was either. This woman standing before me wasn't the person I married, the woman who had promised to stay by my side. How had it all gone so wrong? How had I missed so many signs? I spent hours replaying the past in my head, dissecting every moment, every red flag I had ignored. But no matter how much I thought about it, the answer was always the same. I had lost everything. I knew I couldn't deal with this alone. I needed someone to talk to, someone who could help me process the chaos in my head. So I reached out to Jordan, a friend and confidant I trusted. We worked together, and he'd always been the guy I could turn to in tough times. When I met him for coffee, I was a wreck. My hands trembled as I stirred my cup, and my voice cracked as I tried to explain everything. I don't know what to do, man, I finally admitted, the words feeling raw on my tongue. She's been with him. My brother. I'm broken. I don't even know where to start. Jordan leaned back, taking it all in. He sighed deeply. That's brutal, he said quietly. Look, you've got two choices here. You can walk away, just cut your losses, or... He paused, giving me a pointed look. You can make them regret it. I blinked, caught off guard by his bluntness. Revenge? I muttered, shaking my head. Jordan shrugged. Sometimes, it's the only thing that feels right. But you've got to ask yourself, what's going to make you feel better? Walking away with your dignity, or making sure they feel even a fraction of the pain you're going through? His words hung heavily in the air. I thought about them for days afterward. Part of me wanted to leave, to escape the wreckage of our marriage and start fresh. But another part of me, the wounded, angry part, wanted to make Savannah feel the same searing pain I felt. I wanted her to regret every moment she had spent with Mason. Savannah and I tried to talk about divorce, but the conversations went nowhere. It didn't feel right. It felt unfinished, like there was something left hanging between us. I was trapped between two conflicting impulses, letting go and lashing out, and I had no idea which one would finally set me free. In the weeks that followed, the tension between Savannah and me became unbearable. We were stuck in a cycle of strained conversations, unresolved anger, and painful silences. I couldn't forgive her, not yet. But I also couldn't keep living like this. Mason, thankfully, had disappeared from the picture, whether out of shame or guilt, I didn't know. He didn't reach out, and I didn't care to hear from him. Savannah and I decided to try one last honest conversation before taking the next step. We sat across from each other in the living room, the same room where I had first seen the cracks in our marriage. She looked worn down, as if carrying the weight of her own regret. I don't know how to fix this, I said, breaking the silence. Maybe it's too late for us. I don't want it to be too late, she whispered. I know I hurt you in ways I can't take back. But I still love you, Ethan. I didn't handle things the way I should have, and I'll carry that with me forever. I don't want to lose everything we built. Hearing her say those words stirred something inside me, something buried beneath the layers of pain and betrayal. But it wasn't enough. Love wasn't a cure for the damage we had done to each other. I thought about the person I had become over the years, absent, detached, always chasing career success at the expense of my family. And then I thought of Savannah, searching for connection in the worst possible way. We had both failed each other. I don't know if we can go back to the way things were, I replied, my voice softer than I expected. But maybe that's the point. Maybe we shouldn't go back. If we're going to move forward, it has to be different. We have to be different. She nodded slowly. We do. And I'm willing to try. But only if you are. For the first time in weeks, we looked at each other with a glimmer of hope, however fragile. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a step. We agreed to start therapy together to learn how to rebuild trust, if that was even possible. It wasn't a promise to stay together forever. It was a commitment to try for the sake of each other and the life we had once dreamed of. In the coming months, things didn't magically get better. We had setbacks, arguments, moments when the weight of the past felt overwhelming. But we kept showing up, for each other, for the kids, and for ourselves. Slowly we began to heal. There were no perfect endings here. We didn't just close the door on the pain, and some wounds would always leave scars. But we chose to confront the truth, to stop pretending we hadn't both made mistakes. And maybe that was enough, a real chance at redemption. Whether we made it long-term or not didn't matter as much anymore. What mattered was that we weren't trapped in the cycle of silence and denial. We had faced the truth together and were finally learning how to live with it. And in that there was peace. For the first time in a long time, there was peace.